I'm Dr. Jennifer Vanasse, Assistant Professor in Atmospheric Sciences at Texas Tech University, and my research focuses on connecting weather and climate to human health through the study of human biometeorology and bioclimatology. I'll be talking to you in this video about how changes to our climate system can impact two very important health outcomes. When we think of climate change, we might think of long-term changes that we won't experience for hundreds of years. But many of the direct impacts of the changing climate are present in various forms today. Our health as humans and the health of the environment are intrinsically connected to the weather and climate. And with a change in climate and more variable climate, health effects that we may have experienced 50 years ago may become more amplified, more widespread, or more prevalent in given locations. Recently, the United States Global Climate Change Research Program wrote a climate and health assessment linking various climate drivers to health outcomes. In the report, they use a concept of exposure pathways to explore the connections of climate and health to potential negative consequences. An exposure pathway is a means by which a person experiences a harmful substance or environment, which for our purposes in this learning exercise includes extreme heat exposure and air pollution exposure. Such exposures are linked either directly or indirectly to causing or exacerbating acute and chronic diseases. Many of the pathways of exposure are influenced by vulnerability, which includes social determinants of health and behavioral choices. The first exposure connected to a warming world and growing urban areas is extreme heat. When the ambient environment constrains energy dissipation from the body or adds energy to the body, there is a greater risk of an increase in the core body temperature. This loss of internal temperature control can result in a spectrum of illnesses, including heat cramps, heat exhaustion, heat stroke, and hyperthermia. Extreme heat can also worsen chronic conditions, such as cardiovascular disease, respiratory disease, cerebrovascular disease, and cause people to be less active and healthy in general. During a heat wave, when cities experience 3 or more days of high temperatures during the day, we often start seeing anomalous heat-related mortality, or death, and morbidity, or illness, with increased hospital admissions for cardiovascular, kidney, and respiratory disorders. There are certain subpopulations that are affected more by the heat, which include the elderly, sick, immobile, socially isolated, and young. For example, in 2003, a heat wave in Europe resulted in 70,000 anomalous deaths, with many of those being the elderly. Humans are now experiencing the effects of heat to an even greater extent. Historically, the probability of a record high or low temperature occurring was roughly the same. But in recent years, roughly twice as many record highs have been recorded versus record lows. These rising temperatures, compounded with the urban heat island effect, or the presence of high temperatures in urban areas, are causing a rise in the intensity and frequency of heat waves. The urban heat island effect is at its strongest overnight, which is the time when humans and wildlife typically recover during heat wave conditions. We can lessen urban temperatures and the greenhouse effect by using strategies that create cooler spaces and limit energy use, such as creating green space. This passively cools nearby buildings so that people stay cooler and less energy is required for indoor cooling. As our climate changes, the air we breathe also changes, and this is the second key exposure that I'll discuss. Higher levels of air pollution and aeroallergens are two pathways linked to serious health outcomes. As temperatures rise, the creation of photochemical ozone, a ground-level pollutant that harms our respiratory systems, rises. Ozone is a secondary pollutant that needs heat, light, and primary pollutants to be created. And thus, with more days of higher temperatures, cities see more unhealthy ozone days. Unless offset by additional pollutant reductions, such as lowering the nitrogen dioxide or carbon monoxide from cars and industry, these climate-driven increases in ozone may cause premature deaths, hospital visits, lost school days, and acute respiratory symptoms. Worldwide, outdoor air pollution causes 2.6 million deaths annually. Policies and investments supporting cleaner transport, energy-efficient housing, power generation, industry, and better municipal waste management would reduce key sources of urban outdoor air pollution. A second ambient exposure that affects our respiratory system is airborne allergens, or aeroallergens. These are very fine particulates, such as pollen, that have been increasing with rising carbon dioxide levels and temperatures. Carbon dioxide promotes the growth of plants that release aeroallergens, thus increasing their concentrations. With a changing and more variable climate, we are also seeing altered geographic and seasonal distributions of plants and trees that release aeroallergens, and thus individuals are being exposed to differing types of particles. Rising temperatures are also causing longer pollen seasons through the onset of earlier springs and later winters. Poor air quality from pollution or allergens, whether outdoors or indoors, negatively affects the human respiratory and cardiovascular systems, causes premature death, increased hospital visits, allergic sensitization, and asthma episodes, all of which thereby limit physical activity, productivity, and school days. Nearly 6.8 million children in the United States are affected by asthma, already making it a major chronic disease of childhood that will be exacerbated by warming temperatures. In order to understand the health effects, researchers like me measure meteorological attributes to determine city-scale and human-scale exposures. We assess what levels of exposures are present, what the given health effects may be to a population, and importantly, what changes could be made to improve the ambient environment. For example, our instrumentation measuring temperature, humidity, wind speed, radiation, and even air pollution can be set up within city canyons or at intersections to assess small-scale heating and air pollution concentrations. In turn, this can be used to make recommendations to city planners where pollution mitigation strategies, such as bike lanes, are needed, that will lessen exposures to both air pollution and anthropogenic heat. Dealing with the exposure pathways of extreme heat and air pollution into the future will require not only mitigation, but also adaptation. Adaptation refers to dealing with the impacts of climate change, while adaptive capacity refers to the capacity of a system to adapt if the environment where the system exists is changing. This means that in a changing climate, humans must implement strategies and policies that allow continued existence and human well-being. The impacts of exposure pathways to human disease, however, will be limited by the adaptive capacity of human populations. Increasing human tolerance to extreme heat, mitigating air pollution with new technologies, and having a healthier, less vulnerable, and more resilient human population in general can lessen the health effects of exposures due to climate change.